So today's scripture for consideration is found in Genesis chapter 30, starting with verse 25 and going on through chapter 31, ending with verse 55, which is the last verse of that chapter.
And I have entitled this lesson A Reconciliation of Sorts, because while it is true we are about to be finished with the ongoing trials and tribulations of Jacob and his uncle Laban, and also his two wives, Leah and Rebecca, and by extension, their servants and everyone else, I'm not sure I'm 100% satisfied with the reconciliation. It seems a reconciliation that, like so many other forms of reconciliation, is as best as humanity can manage sometimes. And we'll get to that in a second. I should also say before we dive in that we will not be reading this text in its entirety, as it's a very long passage, but also it was difficult for me to discern where to focus. And so we will be taking a very broad view with some points where we'll zoom in and take a more careful look. But it was difficult. I have to admit, I really struggled for these past weeks with how to approach today's passage. I was determined to do so because it's my conviction, and it's a consensus amongst biblical scholars, that when it's in the Bible, it's important for someone. Somebody felt the need to include it and to keep it and to preserve it because it was important. So if the importance of a text isn't obvious to us today, it's our job to try to dig and pick at it and figure out in what sense it was important to the original readers of the text and those that preserved it, the scribes that preserved it and copied it. Under the guidance of God's Holy Spirit is our conviction. So that being said, let us turn to the text. But first, a quote by Freetham from the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary. He writes, "This story of the rivalry between Jacob and Laban no doubt has complex origins, not least because the progression of the thought remains unclear. The unit may have been glossed by an editor with agricultural or other interests." So that's a quote that is in the spirit of what I've been saying, that it's hard to decide or discern where to exactly focus over the course of these stories or this overarching narrative. All this to say, if it seemed a bit hard for you to find a clear focus or point of emphasis in today's reading, you are not alone. I've struggled with what to say for weeks. I've decided that a broad overview of today's reading with a clear focus on the overall point of the Laban / Jacob / Leah / Rachel saga may be best. Basically, what we discover is more of the same behavior from Laban and Jacob. As a matter of fact, I initially entitled this lesson More of the Same. Each is deceiving and is being deceived. Rachel also gets in on the game before they leave Haran, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The story will conclude with a peaceful arrangement, but also a permanent familial separation. So it's a mixed bag. So to the text, starting with verse 25 of the 30th chapter, which reads, "When Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, 'Send me away, that I may go to my home and country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know very well the service I have given you.' But Laban said to him, 'If you will allow me to say so, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages, and I will give it.' Jacob said to him, 'You yourself know how I have served you, and how your cattle have fared with me. For you had little before I came, and it has increased abundantly. And the Lord has blessed you wherever I turn. But now, when shall I provide for my own household also?' He said, 'What shall I give you?'" So Jacob feels as though he has put in his time, and I don't think we can blame him. It's been 20 years that he has been working for his uncle. Now he wants to focus on building his own household and familial wealth. Laban names the obvious. "The Lord has blessed me because of you." In fact, Laban claims that this was revealed to him in a dream, but it would have been obvious to any observer. So Laban enters into a new attempt at bargaining, which makes me want to pose this question. Why should Jacob trust Laban in the bargaining? He has already duped Jacob a handful of times, and he would be well within his rights, he being Jacob, to decline this offer for a new bargain or new contract and head on his way. So why doesn't he? Well, the answer we'll soon find is that it seems that Jacob has a new trick up his sleeve. The text goes on. Jacob said, "You shall not give me anything. If you will do this for me, I will again feed your flock and keep it. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep and every black lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and such shall be my wages." Skipping over a few verses to 34, Laban says, "Good, let it be as you have said." But that day, Laban removed the male goats that were striped and spotted, and all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had white on it, and every lamb that was black, and put them in charge of his sons, and set them a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob, while Jacob was pasturing the rest of Laban's flock. I have a picture of a speckled goat to our right, which is called a Jacob's goat. I found on the internet this breed is named after Jacob because of this biblical story, which I think is great. But you see what's happening here. Laban thinks he has tricked Jacob into more free labor. He thinks it won't even cost him the speckled sheep and goats he has agreed to part with. But Jacob, apparently aware of the deception, hatches a plan by which he hopes to profit at Laban's expense. More on that in a second. But first, what fun, a linguistic pun. Handel writes, according to this arrangement, Laban, whose name means white, retains the white sheep and the black goats, which are their normal colors. And so as you see, Laban secreting away the sheep and goats that have white in them, his own name meaning white. For the Hebrew readers, this would have been a linguistic play on words, and it was a lot of fun because the one whose name was white ended up without the very sheep and goats that he sought to retain, whilst also getting some free labor on the side. And so just an aside, a little linguistic pun that we wouldn't really notice in our English translations. The story continues, verse 37. Then Jacob took fresh rods of poplar and almond and plane and peeled white streaks in them, exposing the white of the rods. He set the rods that he had peeled in front of the flocks in troughs, that is, the water places where the flocks came to drink. And since they bred when they came to drink, the flocks bred in front of the rods, and so the flocks produced young that were striped, speckled, and spotted. Jacob separated the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the striped and completely black animals in the flock of Laban. And he put his own droves apart and did not put them with Laban's flock. Skip over a few verses that basically describe how he singles out the stronger ones for breeding and sets the weaker ones aside, picking up in verse 43. Thus the man grew exceedingly rich and had large flocks and male and female slaves and camels and donkeys. Handel writes, while difficult to understand, the plan may assume an ancient belief that what animals look toward when breeding, in this case striped rods for multicolored animals, determines the coloration of their offspring. End quote. That's what Freetham wrote. Sorry, not Handel. And here's what I write. Here we see another ancient superstition offered as a solution without qualification. In the world of this text, it just works. I'm reminded of the Mandrake Root we read about earlier in chapter 30, which was thought to be an infertility cure. And while such superstitions should strike modern readers as odd, for the sake of the story, we should simply roll with it. The main point. Jacob, the trickster, turns the tables on the also trickster Laban. Handel writes, Jacob turns the tables on Laban by breeding discolored animals from Laban's flock using sympathetic magic. The animals that see discolored rods of wood while breeding will bear discolored offspring. And again, notes that white streaks an echo of Laban's name. Moreover, Jacob only does this for the strong animals. The weaker ones he lets breed normally. As a result, the feebler were Laban's and the stronger were Jacob's. Thus, Jacob tricks Laban, who had tried once again to trick him, and acquires great wealth. And so Jacob, apt to his own sort of tricks, although at this point he has fallen victim to similar ploys. I'm just going to summarize the first 16 verses of Genesis 31 for time's sake. Basically, it goes like this. Genesis again describes family conflict. Laban's sons feel Jacob has robbed their father, probably because about what we just read with the striped sheep and the goats. Laban likes Jacob less than previously. Jacob believes Laban has cheated him, so Jacob and his wives decide to leave secretly. Upon learning of Jacob's flight, Laban sets off in pursuit. Rachel has stolen her father's household gods. By now, these sorts of familial conflicts should be well familiar. Green writes in the Common English Bible Commentary, these sorts of conflicts occur frequently because Genesis focuses on family stories. In biblical Israel, the family is the basic unit of society. Each higher level of social organization, clan, tribe, kingdom, is modeled on family structures. In such a society, the stability of the family is essential for the stability of society as a whole. The passing of authority from one generation to the next is a matter of highest concern. The most pressing end is to pass authority without the violence that could destroy the family and society itself. And I would add that passing authority or transitioning from one form of authority or power into another as time rolls on is a problem that we are still faced with today. It's a perpetual problem. But in short, my paraphrase, Jacob's very survival hinges upon a positive outcome here. The question becomes, where is the off-ramp that leads from the way of trickery and deception and back to healthy familial relations? The duplicity and double dealings of Jacob and Laban have led to tenuous/severed family ties. Jacob fled from Esau for his life, only to find himself enthralled to Laban. Now, Jacob is on the run again. Where will it end? One more note. In the text that we skimmed over and didn't read, Leah and Rachel voice their own anger and displeasure at having been slighted. They say, and I'm quoting from verses 14 and 15, "Is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has been using up the money given for us." This, I posit, is the likely motive for Rachel's theft of her family's household gods. More on this in a moment. So we'll skip over verses 22 through 24. Basically describes Laban discovering their flight and setting out in pursuit. Verse 25 of chapter 31, Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban with his kinsfolk camped in the hill country of Gilead. Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done? You have deceived me and carried away my daughters like captives of the sword. Why did you flee secretly and deceive me and not tell me? I would have sent you away with mirth and songs, with tambourine and lyre. And why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell? What you have done is foolish. It is in my power to do you harm. But the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, 'Take heed, you speak to Jacob, neither good nor bad.'" So here, Laban postures as a spurned father who has been treated unjustly. And if you have trouble taking him at his word and taking Laban's speech at face value, you're not alone. Up to this point, he has not shown himself to be someone who deals fairly with Jacob, not the sort of person who we could imagine willingly and of his own accord sending them away with mirth and songs, tambourine and lyre, send them off in style, in other words. I think that it's very understandable why Jacob left secretly and on the sly. And also, the very nature of his advance on Jacob suggests a desire to inflict harm. As a matter of fact, you hear that echoed in his words. Actually, not even echoed. He says outright, "It is in my power to do you harm," verse 29. So that's why God appeared to Laban in a dream, to assuage him from harsh action. Handel writes, "Kinsfolk pursued 7 days, a picture of a quasi-military campaign." If that passage read to you like he was out on a military campaign, it's the same kind of language used in other passages that describe persons going out on a rescue mission or on some form of military conquest. This image, in combination with the setting of the hill country of Gilead and God's warning to Laban the Aramean, create a connection with the historical conflict between Israel and Abram. Before I continue quoting, I pause to note, as we've seen in other stories, that while these stories in their narration are about specific individuals, in the broader sense for for early readers, they were about the nations and the tribes of Israel and the surrounding lands, each symbolized by these names. So in this case, Laban symbolizing the Arameans, which is where he was from. This is why in this text it refers to him in times as Laban the Aramean, and then Jacob, and it's to help them come to understand their own history and conflicts with these neighboring peoples. The quote goes on: the region of Gilead in Transjordan was contested by Israel and Abram in the 9th century, and the encounter of Laban and Jacob resonates with this historical conflict. Before we move on to the next slide, one more quote from the text, verse 30. To conclude, after he has said, hey, why did you leave? I would have thrown you a big party. He says, even though you had to go because you longed greatly for your father's house, why did you steal my gods? So here's a second motive given for Laban's pursuit, a motive which is far more plausible for reasons we'll get to in a moment. But for now, I'll just say that motive seems a lot more in keeping with Laban's character, that he would go out in pursuit of Jacob because he has been robbed. So Jacob, knowing nothing of this, by the way, knowing nothing of the gods being stolen by Rachel, his favorite wife, answers Laban, and this is his reason for leaving. Verse 31, because I was afraid, for I thought that you would take your daughters from me by force. But anyone with whom you find your gods shall not live. In the presence of our kinsfolk, point out what I have that is yours and take it. Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the gods. As I've already said, Jacob names a very plausible motive for his secret flight: fear. His fear of Laban seems, in my estimation, justified. As for the household gods, Jacob can rightly plead ignorance. In fact, he is so confident that he calls a curse on anyone discovered to have stolen the gods. If he does not know that this would put the crosshairs right on his favorite wife as a target for this curse. So the audience should be on the edge of their seats as Laban is searching for the household gods. What is about to happen? A few words first before we move on, though, about household gods. They were held as great symbols. Let me start over. Household gods held great symbolism and importance for the family. Fritham writes, they were human-shaped images of gods that were symbols of Laban's authority over his household, perhaps tokens of inheritance. This provides a motive for Rachel's theft, as she and her sister have already made it plain that they feel disinherited, used, and ill-treated by their father. Perhaps by stealing her household gods, she hopes to reclaim, some of her dignity. And I try to think of a modern analogy for what this might be like. Perhaps a softer analogy would be to think of a family crest, except for the family crest having some sort of token power or magical power that could bring about positive results. But at the same time, in this case, symbolizing all that the family means, all that it is worth, its heritage, its possessions, all of that is wrapped up in these gods, which explains why Rachel would take them, because she feels like she has been robbed of everything else. So to summarize the next 3 verses, I'll quote Handel. This is where Laban is searching for his stolen property. The scene of Laban's search of the tents is suspenseful and comical. In Rachel's tent, domestic space, a woman's space, Laban is completely outwitted. Laban feels all about, but he cannot feel the saddlebags because of Rachel's ruse. The father loses the symbols of family blessing because of his daughter's ruse, confirming Rachel as a trickster and Jacob's true counterpart. There is further irony, since Rachel, Leah, and Jacob have indeed inherited Laban's wealth, but due to the agency of God, not Laban's household gods. So what was Rachel's ruse? Well, she hid the gods in her camel's saddle. When her father approached to search the camel, she said, "Let not my lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the way of woman is upon me." And in short, she is claiming to be on her period. Rachel, the second-born daughter of Laban, tricks her father out of symbols of his family inheritance, just as her husband, the second-born son of Isaac, tricked his own father out of his brother's blessing. And so you see echoes between the behavior of Rachel and the behavior of Jacob. She is clearly, as Handel puts it, a fitting counterpart to Jacob's true counterpart. It's a really funny scene. And you see, look at the picture here to your right. This was the only picture I could find in high resolution of Rachel sitting on the camel, which I think the text clearly describes her as sitting on the camel. There doesn't seem to be any ambiguity about that. But for some reason, they had Rachel sitting politely off to the side next to the camel. And most of these works of art were hundreds of years old. And I don't know the reason for that, but I wonder if there was something about putting women on top of, horses or camels or something that just wasn't done in art. I don't know. It was a big mystery to me. So we're left with the interesting work of art that we see to our right. Back to the text, verse 36. Then Jacob became angry and upbraided Laban. Jacob said to Laban, "What is my offense? What is my sin that you have hotly pursued me? Although you have felt about through all my goods, what have you found of all your household goods? Set it here before my kinsfolk and your kinsfolk, so that they may decide between us two. These 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried, and I have not eaten the rams of your flocks. That which was torn by wild beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it myself. Of my hand you required it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. It was like this with me. By day the heat consumed me, and the cold by night, and my sheep fled from my eyes. These 20 years I have been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock, and you have changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night." So, long-winded speech, and you can imagine Jacob giving it whilst shouting with his finger pointed hard in his uncle's face. When Laban's search comes up empty, Jacob becomes rightfully indignant, not because he is right about the theft of the gods, but because he has been exploited by Laban for 20 years. Jacob is caught in cycles of deception and exploitation that began, remind us, when he first took advantage of his brother Esau, tricking him out of his birthright. In Genesis chapter 25, Jacob is tricked in turn by Laban. Jacob then tricks Laban. Rachel tricks Laban. When will it end? Can they run forever? Can this carry on forever? Well, we have some form of reconciliation, some form of restitution. I call your attention to the picture on the right, which is an absolutely accurate historical portrayal, complete with the parasol and everything else. I'm kidding, of course. Verse 43. Then Laban answered and said to Jacob, "The daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. But what can I do today about these daughters of mine, or about their children whom they have borne? Come now, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me." So Laban concedes nothing, writes Freetham, and yet he decides the time has come to cut his losses. He says, "It's mine, it's mine, it's mine, it's all mine, I don't care what you say." Laban, refusing to admit defeat publicly, claims that everyone and everything really belongs to him. He views them in terms of property, but that he will be magnanimous and conclude a non-aggression pact with Jacob. You get the idea or the feeling that he just doesn't have very many options at this point. So he cuts his losses. So I'll summarize to the very end by quoting Handel. He writes, "The covenant of peace between Laban and Jacob is woven together from E and J passages that have been carefully harmonized. Note that 2 symbols of the covenant are erected, a pillar and a heap of stones. There are 2 meals. There are 2 names of the place, Galeed, a variation of Gilead, and Mizpah. Laban makes 2 speeches announcing the stipulations of the covenant. In one, Jacob is to treat Laban's daughters well and take no other wives. And God is witness." It's from the Elohist source. But he goes on to write, in the other, neither party will pass beyond the covenant marker, and God is invoked to judge between them. Verses 51 to 54, mostly from the Yahwist source. Both of Laban's speeches to Jacob are eloquent and noble, and his last gestures, kissing and blessing his grandchildren and daughters, rehabilitate his character and provide a proper reconciliation. So hugs and kisses, they set up monuments, they have a couple of feasts. A couple, by the way, because we have two sources here. But again, that's the way that much of the Torah was put together. So a few words about these sacred pillars or the mound of stones, depending on the source that we're looking at. And the way that the editor of the Torah makes it seem is that there's one, which is good work on him. That's kind of the work of the editor to weave it into a readable story. Green writes, the sacred pillar and mound of stones are intended as boundary markers between Jacob's and Laban's lands. The stone mound is named both in Hebrew, Gilead, and in Aramaic. Aramaic is the language of the land where Laban lived, east of biblical Israel. Because Gilead sounds like Gilead, this story explained the name of this territory east of the Jordan for early readers. It also explained the boundary marker there and the peace between the Israelites and the Arameans. Fritham writes, in fact, the fact that these two individuals, after deception upon deception, could part in peace, however strained the relationship, testifies to the work of God. They go their separate ways. Laban is not heard from again. As I said, a reconciliation of sorts. Some conclusions. We've seen in the chapters that lead up to today's story, the consequences of deception and double dealing compound. And I'll add compound again and again and again. If we are not careful, we will find ourselves living in secrecy and in fear, our relationships in tatters, and unable to live alongside those with whom we have dealt unfairly. However, an imperfect peace is better than no peace at all. Laban would forego his claim on Jacob, his daughters, his livestock, and servants. Jacob would cut his losses and run. Actually, I might add, he left with quite a lot. But in the end, all lives were spared. But the intimacy of close proximity is lost. Consequently, the relationships are lost. Here is a reconciliation in part, but not in total. The best these two schemers can do is cut their losses and part ways. This is not the worst option, but it is not the best. The monuments set up would hold a double meaning going forward, alluded to in today's text. One, they remind future descendants of Jacob and Laban that the God who bears witness will take note of future injustices carried out on one another. That's why the naming of this pillar or mound of rocks means that God witnesses, or God sees, or God looks on. Those who cross these boundaries to do violence will be witnessed by a righteous God. One may well consider this before treating another human unfairly or without dignity. The second meaning is a reminder that there remains a divide between these two families, a divide caused by selfishness and duplicity. It actually came to be seen as the border between these two sometimes warring peoples. I think that these monuments serve as a sad, lamentable testimony to the human condition. One may well reflect on one's own relationships and how they are strengthened by honesty and selfless compassion, and conversely damaged by our own misdeeds. We do well to remember that these stories were read through the centuries by peoples who are trying to understand their own strifes and conflicts often experienced by way of familial and tribal disputes of their own. The stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob served as national origin stories and were interpreted as means by which the Israelites may better understand the complexities of their relationships to kin and neighboring nations alike. When approached by way of this lens, these stories serve as a warning to us all. We should not treat our kin or neighbors with any form of double dealing or seek to aggrandize or enrich ourselves at the expense of other peoples. Today's national borders may well be seen as monuments similar to the monuments set up by Jacob and Laban, as lamentable acquiescence to the reality that we have not yet been reconciled to global neighbors. We must strive to do better. Fritham, in the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, closes this saga with these words. The author places the birth of Israel as a community of faith within an admixture of familial conflict, human love and service, and ongoing divine blessing in the midst of failure. As such, the story is not simply about origins. It reveals the fundamental character of Israel's continuing life with God through generations. and it shapes the very heart of Israel's understanding of God as one who works on behalf of families like this one. Indeed, it speaks about and to the community of faith in every age. Yeah, no, that was a lot. Questions, comments, thoughts?
Only about the camel and the saddlebags.
Yeah.
Because if you go back to 33, it says, so Laban went into Jacob's tent and Leah's tent and into the tent of the two maidservants, but he found nothing. And after he came out of Leah's tent, he enters Rachel's tent. I'm thinking the camel's not inside the tent.
Well, it says that my translation reads, Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them in the camel's saddle and sat on them. So maybe she's sitting on the saddle inside the tent.
Right. Because I looked up using John's laptop. You're able to look up all the one Bible Hub. You can get all different translations.
Yeah.
And not a one of them indicates that she's on a camel. There's about, 25 translations. I didn't see a one that I think that the saddlebags have been taken inside the tent because it says he went inside the tent.
It's my own imagination constructing the story. I think you're probably right. That explains why I was so frustrated in my search for her on a camel. I had to, and I found one. But yeah, that makes sense.
Who was the artist of that painting?
It was
vaguely like a Chagall, but I don't know. He was very.
I found it in a Google search. When the artist of an artwork is obvious, I'll include it. Since I'm not selling this Bible study, I don't.
But so she may have been sitting on the saddle in the tent.
Well, now that I'm looking at it again, I could see that she has the camel saddle inside the tent. They're like camped out. They're not going anywhere, and so she could be sitting on it as it were a cushion. Mm-hmm. And so, also what you see here is the purity codes that are later in Leviticus and Deuteronomy as it relates to a woman in the time of her period, back read into a story before that sort of legal instruction has been given. At least you can infer it, why that is a fit excuse, right, for Laban to say, okay, I won't bother you then. Or maybe he's just squeamish, or maybe she's in pain or pretending to be for the sake of the ruse. I don't know. But it's really funny.
Well, we know later on when you get into all the laws and stuff, they weren't allowed to touch a woman during her period. So
yeah,
but it's continued.
It's unclean. Mm-hmm.
I should have suggested to Kelly when she gave birth to our children that she wait a week outside of the city until
I'm sure she appreciated that.
That would have gone over well.
I'm sure she wanted to reach up and slap your face right then. Or at least kick you out of the room.
I got interested in what these gods were, and I too looked up on the computer about all the different kinds of ideas, brought forth. And I was trying to decide if they were actually for worship or whether they're just like family heirlooms that were important to them. And it seemed like it wasn't particularly maybe a gold or silver or anything of value, but more of like you would cherish a picture even, or some heirloom passed down through the family.
That's right. And initially in the history of Israel, way early, before they would conceptualize one God of all nations, you'd have tribal gods, and then you would have household gods. And the household gods would be primarily concerned with the affairs and the domestic affairs of that particular family. But they also function as a familial heirloom that would get handed down and came to symbolize, the passing of the household gods would go with the passing of everything else. We talked about inheritance and birthrights and all of that, part of the package, and thus came to symbolize the package. And we see that alive in this story. Now, as time would move forward, these household gods would become a big problem, because as the worship of Israel became more centralized around a tent and then a temple, and the theological claim that there was one God, that Yahweh was not just Israel's God, but the God of all creation, they would find the people lapsing back into a polytheism, and this would become, you read in later stories where this becomes a big problem, depending on what era of Israel's history they found themselves in. And oftentimes in the prophets, in like Isaiah and Jeremiah and others, one of the reasons stated for the decline would be a lapse back into a worship of idols. But for today's story, I think the importance, like, there's no critique made in today's story. They just are, and Rachel takes them. And thinking of them, that's why I brought up a family crest, thinking of them as something that sort of wrapped up the family's honor and possessions and everything as in a symbolic form. That's the important thing for today. That was why Rachel took them, I think, although no clear motive is given, but in light of what she said earlier about feeling disinherited, it makes sense.
It also said the one who ended up with those would get the inheritance too.
And they kind of did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You suppose it could be something like what we think of today as a family Bible?
I think that's a good analogy.
Where you've got all your past history in it and a connection to God.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going for. What I was going for with family crest. But that's even better, I think, because family Bibles can be packed with great religious meaning, or a family could lose their religion but still have it and still use it as a as a symbol of their heritage that they pass on. So it functions. And the family gods in the life of Israel seem to have lapped into that kind of function, as they would, because they kept them. And then when they left Egypt, we read about them taking the gods that they had adopted in Egypt. So they were still at it when they were in Egypt. Like bringing in household gods. And one of the things that they do is they leave with the gods, and that becomes a big problem when they find themselves out in the desert.
I'm not sure that was a picture of a goat.
Well, what do you think? A sheep?
Yeah, I have never, tell me if I'm wrong, I've never seen a goat with horns like that.
You're asking the wrong country boy. I was raised in the country, but not around livestock. So
no, goats have horns. Yeah, there's no question. Goats have horns.
But aren't they just short, stubby horns?
They come in all sizes, I think.
Oh yeah, goat. Yeah, that was a ram. You're right. Now that I'm thinking about it, goats have those straight horns.
Yeah, the little short ones. Yeah.
Let me Jacob's.
I mean, just in case you use this again, I just thought, it's a sheep. Yeah, it's a sheep. Okay.
It was a sheep.
Yeah, we had sheep on the reservation, or they have sheep on the reservation. They have horns. I mean, it's very. Yeah. I had to get used to the idea.
Mm-hmm. I do know that sheep have horns.
Yeah, sheep have horns.
Yeah. The Jacob is a British breed of domestic sheep. It combines two characteristics unusual in sheep. It is piebald, and it is often polycurate or multi-horned. There's interesting.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, that's quite a.
You wouldn't want to meet him in the barnyard, I'll tell you.
That's quite a piece of headgear right there. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
But
that's what I'm thinking.
It does list though, or in verse 34, that there were male goats too. I mean, that was part of the herd.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, there are camels and donkeys and slaves too. Somehow they just kind of, he's got them. Like, so but we find out later in a just as a flourish of the pen that it was a 6-year period when he's narrating his grievances. He goes, for 6 years I watched your herds and flocks, and boy, the story isn't told of him out in the field, but as he recounts it, I was in the hot sun, I was in the cold night when the animals ate the sheep, I just ate a loss and I took it on the chin, and all of these things that given the nature of the dialogue, to a public dialogue where each person in the presence of Laban's people and Jacob's people are making their case, right? I think we're meant to think that they are waxing loquacious and really, really laying it on pretty thick. And the thing that I didn't really notice until this reading was that Laban doesn't exactly concede. He says, it's all mine. Fine, it's mine, but you can have it.
I'm giving it to you now.
Yeah.
You think maybe he's finally learned that God's going to bless Jacob and he better straighten up?
I hope so.
Yeah.
That'd be a good lesson for him to learn.
Well, he certainly was forewarned, in a dream, not to mess with him.
Yeah, which implies that he was going to go and mess with him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then I love the line, I don't love, but I think he's like, I could hurt you.
Yeah.
But God told me not to. And by the way, I'm only here because I miss my kids, so let's.
Oh yeah, they're so important to me.
Yeah.
I sold
That
them.
and my idols.
Yeah.
I sold my daughters and
Yeah. Well, that ends the Laban stories. And so next we'll move on to Jacob's return to his homeland and a reunion with his brother. But first we'll consider chapter 32, which we'll take as one unit. There are 2 stories there. We'll skim through the first half and touch on the important points. And then we will really focus on one of the most memorable passages where Jacob wrestles with God. I think I might have preached on this passage 3 times at least in my years preaching. So it's one that I've thought of again and again. And so I hope to discover new things throughout the course of the week. And if you read chapter 32, we will consider that next week. And by the time you're done, we will know Genesis pretty well, I think, which is good. You'll notice how many cultural references come from these books.
It all goes back to this.
Mm-hmm.
You need this foundation so you can pick it up later. He
Yeah,
doesn't. Even Jesus says the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Right.
And the themes in the Torah, broadly speaking, just keep getting woven in like new layers of harmony in the story of Israel, and then into the Christian story. And they keep getting picked up and thought of in different ways that they hadn't been thought of before, and perhaps not even originally intended by the ones who wrote them down. But that's kind of the way that I think human history builds on itself. And without a knowledge, without an awareness of those metaphors and stories, and like Jacob's sheep, right? I didn't know, right? But you maybe raised Jacob's sheep your whole life and never knew that there's a story about these speckled sheep in the Bible. Stuff like that pops up all the time in our language.
We lived on a farm for a while. When my grandfather was ill, we lived across the street, that house that had belonged to my aunt. And my father bought sheep and put them in the orchard. So we had our own little lamb, Oscar, and he was ours to take care of.
Oh,
But unfortunately, he got sick. And so we dug a hole, and we had to keep digging a long time because his tummy got very big, very bloated. And we had to dig it very deep. We didn't want to have him carted out. We wanted to bury him.
That does. Well, I'm a sucker for animals myself. Matter of fact, I'm surrounded by them right now. I've got the dog at the floor by my feet and the cat over on the bed. But then also, I tried to take in multiple wild animals growing up and had my heart broken again and again and again. I learned the difference between domestic and wild animals, even if you get them very young. It's in their DNA. I was inspired by the book Rascal about a raccoon a boy took in and raised from a bottle when its tree fell when it was a little baby and the mom died. And it's based on this author's real life childhood experiences. And I missed the punchline of the story where he had to let the raccoon go because it was too much of a nuisance in its adult life. But all I fixed on was getting this raccoon. And so I would put out box traps and catch a youth one. And I'd put on leather gloves, and this thing would be like tearing at my fingers through the gloves while I tried to thought I could pet it enough to love me while it was going berserk. I had a run with that happened multiple times. I don't know how many times I caught. I never caught him young enough for one, but then I learned that once I hit puberty, it's almost a lost cause, and it's inhumane to have them neutered or fixed. So there's that. Then I caught a little baby squirrel one time, and it died, and I don't know exactly why. But then I raised a baby rabbit from very small, and she was just like any other rabbit you ever had. I mean, if you've had domestic rabbits, I had domestic rabbits, and they can be quite friendly, especially the females. And once it hit puberty, the same little animal that I fed out of the palm of my hand was terrified of me. There was nothing that could be done. It wanted nothing more than to be out. So I learned a series of hard lessons that way growing up. And don't get me started with box turtles. Why my parents let that go on the way they did.
Yeah, my brother brought home the sweetest little, we thought, baby rabbit from the grounds of the junior high school. He came home from basketball practice, and we thought, oh, this poor thing. And the mother apparently got run over by a mower. And so he brought this, and we thought, oh, this poor thing. And we fed it, and just the overnight we kept it in a large box. I mean, it was huge. This box was huge on the ping pong table in the basement. We thought, we got to figure out what to do for this poor thing. And the next morning it wasn't in the box. We thought, what? And so it had jumped out of the box off the ping pong table and was running around loose in the basement. And we figured if it was strong enough to do that, it probably was not going to be contained. It was old enough to fend for itself. So we set it free, and it stayed in the neighborhood. It ran around our backyard, and others, we saw it for years, and it did grow up, and it was pretty amazing that we misjudged how capable this little bunny was. But that was quite a lesson.
Mine turned friendly to me until it grew up. But then we also, this is going to make me sound like the Beverly Hillbillies, except minus the Beverly Hills. But we were also Ellie Mae Clampett. She always had the animals. But we did raise 2 deer as well that my cousin said drowned in a pond in the summer. I will go on the record. I'm still being recorded. I have my doubts if that's what happened. But my uncle calls us up and says, we've got these 2 baby deer, and we bottle fed them, and they lived in our fenced-in yard until they didn't, and then they just hung around for a little while, and then they made their way off into the wild. And that was a pretty positive experience, I think. I think the deer did well, and I think that we enjoyed it. So
I presently have 8 deer that go through my yard or my backyard over to a neighbor who's feeding them corn on some sort of a metered system. And I hope he doesn't continue during the summer, because I think some of the shrubs and things are going to suffer.
Yes, they will.
I do have a dog though, and so that I think I'm safe there.
Yeah, we've got the deer. We don't feed them, but they find things to eat.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is they draw in the coyotes and the mountain lions, and
they're actually eating my neighbor's holly.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd think holly would be kind of sharp, and she's got some holly bushes, and she was starting to feed him. I said, I don't think that's a good idea.
I go for runs over at Crown Hill Cemetery, and they let me within 15 feet of them when I go over there.
They're pretty used to having people around over there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I could talk about animals all day. I love I'm a nut for them.
But I threw back my curtains on New Year's Day, and I was face to face with a deer that was looking in my window. I mean,
right in your window?
Oh yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, right in the window. That's really, yeah.
I had
Well,
two of them sleep out in the snow in my backyard. At midnight, my dog was having a fit.
Oh,
And I could look out there and see they had bedded down in the snow in my backyard.
That's great.
My closest encounter with a deer was, I was in a house at 86 in college, and the dog was on the breezeway barking up a storm, and I looked out and there was a deer in my neighbor's backyard, and I couldn't figure out where it came from because there wasn't a woods near enough for it to have inhabited. But it just, stood there and looked at the dog barking because the dog was enclosed. So they're strange animals.
Yeah.
anyway.
Well, thank you for this. I actually enjoyed this back half as much as about anything else. As a matter of fact, I'm probably going to leave it in the recording. So everyone, if anyone's interested in hearing us tell our animal stories, well, more power to them.
Okay.
But I'll leave you with that until either Sunday or next week, or I'll see John tomorrow morning with the food pantry. And God bless you all, and read Genesis chapter 32. Bye, everyone.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.